Good evening and welcome to Listen In with Sunaparanta. Today we're moving away from the visual arts and moving into an art that we're all quite agreed brings people together in a different way, which is cooking. And especially food, I think, in a lot of Indian homes brings people together in a way that very few else does and makes people happier. Recipes are often protected in households with their lives and get passed on from generation to generation. And someone like Krish, who's with us today, has written a book about the science behind some of these things. Why did your grandmother tell you to do something or not to do something? Why do we measure things the way that we do in an Indian kitchen? Krish is in conversation today with Roshni Bajaj Sanghvi, and I'm so happy to have both of you with us today to take us into this amazing subject. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Roshni, who is a food and travel writer and a graduate of the French Culinary Institute in New York. She's a contributing editor at Vogue magazine and has been published in several publications, including but not limited to Condé Nast Traveler, Roads and Kingdoms, Scroll.in, The Guardian, Mint Lounge, and The Hindu. Roshni is passionate about obscure ingredients and always knows the best places to eat. Thank you, Roshni, for making the time to be in conversation with Krish today and for Sunaparanta. Thank you, Krish, as well. And congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ishita. Hi, Krish. Hi, everyone. I'm excited about today's session because I've been reading Krish's book for about 10 days now, and there are parts that I keep revisiting. And it is possibly one of the best food books I've read in a while, especially because it talks about something that has never been spoken about before, which is the science of Indian food and Indian cooking and how science works in the context of the Indian kitchen and the way we prepare everything from rice and chapati to potatoes and complex, intense masala mixes, various gravies. There's very little that is mystified anymore about Indian food. You understand why things work the way they do, which is something that so far has sort of been has been passed on as a sort of heritage bit of information, oral tradition, etc., about how to cook rice, how to make chapatis soft, all of that. Krish Ashok has written about Indian food while taking the mystery and the intimidation out of both Indian food and the science behind it. And he breaks it down to its scientific principles, explaining through physics, chemistry, and biology, how ingredients and techniques work in our Indian kitchens and what separates excellent cooks and delicious food from not so excellent or delicious things. He talks about the properties of metals used for cooking vessels with as much alacrity and humor as he does about meat and potatoes, quite literally. Krish Ashok can also talk about water in ways that make our eyes widen with wonder. In fact, there were several moments while reading the book where I felt like Krish is the science teacher we wish we had. Never ever before has anybody made me think of a saline solution as a late Roman Empire orgy. And it's all really, really conversational. This is not your typical food book or your typical science book either. It's matter of fact and it's funny. It's down to earth and revelatory. It's whip smart and it's still accessible. This is a book written for right now when so many of us find ourselves spending more time in the kitchen than ever before. It's also a book for those of us who have been cooking for many years and only kind of maybe perhaps know why we do what we do. It's also a book for people who have never cooked before and are just starting and want to accelerate their learning curve. This book explains simply and scientifically why our rice turns out perfectly on one day and completely inedible on the next. So Krish, let's start at the very beginning. How did the idea for a book like this come to an engineer? I mean, what made you want to write this book?
So thank you. I think that introduction was exactly the sort of dream blurb that that I might want behind my book and perhaps on my Amazon page and so on. Thank you so much for that. And it's lovely that you've actually sort of pointed down all these sorts of things. I had great fun writing this book. In fact, it's in some sense I can sometimes go overboard with humor, and I had to really sort of tone it down and say, what, let's get the facts out, and then let's sneak in a bit of humor here and there. But the idea for this book essentially is has taken a while actually. So it's I've been someone who's been cooking for a fair almost since my teenage years. And in a sense that I was fortunate enough to grow up in a household where at least my grandmother and mother, didn't think that boys should not, come to the kitchen and so on. They also helped that with three boys in the house, so it wasn't much of a choice really. And so every time my mother would travel, so I would be the one as the eldest person to, cook for the family and so on. And I think also, the first time I traveled abroad was also the first time I really had to, cook 7 days of pretty much every day. And that was actually the first time I got thinking about how do I write down, sort of capture the knowledge that my grandmother and my grand-aunts and all these great people in the family who are great cooks, how do I capture that? Right? So, the assumption then was that you write down recipes. But that wasn't so easy. My grandmother didn't think in terms of recipes. And, she would say, just swad anusar sort of thing, right? Just take a pinch of this, a pinch of that. She didn't understand what a tablespoon or a teaspoon, or she didn't weigh things and so on. And it kind of, in some sense, for a while, I've been thinking about whether recipes are the way to really capture the kind of tacit knowledge that they have, right? And unfortunately, a lot of that tacit knowledge doesn't make its way into a recipe. It's not the format for that at all. So things like how do you actually make sure to estimate the right amount of water? And sometimes recipe writers tend to simplify that to a 1:2 or a 2:4. Cups of water don't scale at all. I mean, if you're using 6 cups of water for 3 cups of rice, you're going to end up with mush, right? So in a sense that it's always been in my head that there has to be a way, and I think going back to what Ishita said, right? So in fact, I really want to treat the art of cooking as the craft of cooking, right? That's something that I kind of make clear. Art is something that's supposed to be mysterious and sort of inscrutable and something that's sort of, divine and so on. Yes, there is an artistic element to cooking, the ability to create something that, gives joy to people in a restaurant or in a home is art indeed, right? But at the same time, when you have to do this 2 or 3 times a day, it's not art, it's craft. And craft needs documentation. And what I mean by documentation is that it needs a way to really break it down into simple, sort of modular bits of scientifically verified steps that anyone can then repeat, right? Without having to literally be mentored by their grandmothers or having cooked years and years before they, fine tune that. And that's basically, what I was targeting. Say that, can I write a science book for Indian cooking, like some of the food science books in the West, which kind of focus on modular techniques that are common when you make a pasta, when you bake bread, or when you, bake a cake and so on, or the science of desserts and so on. Can I take that for Indian cooking, cooking rice, cooking, wheat, legumes and vegetables and onions and ginger, garlic, spices, and, sort of ending with putting it all together, how to make gravies, how to make dishes and so on, in a way to liberate the cook from recipes, right? So say that, don't think recipes are the absolute, they're like gospel truth, right? A recipe is essentially whatever someone came up with in their home at that point of time, right? And it's not like people who write down recipes do it 100 times and then weigh it every time and do all of this. It's people are making best guesses, and everybody is different. You might not have all the ingredients. And I want people to think that, no, it doesn't matter. It's the broad techniques that matter. You can replace any ingredients you want if you understand what they do and what taste they bring and so on. So that's why, the idea is to write this book. And this comes from my software background because, in my day job, that's in a sense what we end up doing, right? The idea to solve a large complex problem with a ton of really 23-year-olds is to break it down into simpler bits of things that people can't mess up. Then I put it all together and build something really complicated, right? So that's, in some sense, it is software engineering in that sense. So that's the approach I've kind of taken here.
So this is kind of like the coder's approach to Indian cooking, would you say?
Well, in a sense, yes. In the sense of organizing the mental model is sort of more software driven. Obviously, the techniques themselves are simple physics, basic high school level physics, biology, chemistry. As I said, I'm not going to write any complex equations because none of that is relevant to the person cooking.
Yeah, it is high school science. I mean, it definitely took me back to those lessons. It's just so much more fun and so much more interesting. Tell me about the kind of research and experiments it took to write this book. I mean, since you've looked at food so scientifically, did you do a lot of research and did you conduct a lot of experiments in the kitchen?
Very much, right? So one, there are actually 3 levels of this research. So one is that being a software guy, I actually downloaded a ton of recipes, right? I mean, So one of the things I do is I've sort of trained myself to listen to or watch YouTube videos or listen to podcasts at 3 times the speed, right? So I can get through, if it's a 15-minute video, it's 5 minutes for me, right? So I watch it at like 3x. So I really just for each category of dish, I saw a ton of things, and obviously sort of saw what was inconsistent, what was consistent, and what were some of the people I trusted really the most. There are people I sort of link to in the references and say that there are some YouTube channels that you must follow because their methods and the way they go about it are very, very scientific, right? So, and I kind of refer to this Bong Eats and Nisha Madhulika and some of these others on YouTube who are actually quite fantastic if you pay attention to how meticulously they do and how they don't no pseudoscience, no nutrition pseudoscience at all, right? So there is that one bit of sort of external research, because it's safe to say that there's infinite amount of food content, Indian food content. I mean, there are more YouTube channels than you can imagine, more food blogs than you can imagine. So there's a problem of plenty, if you will, right, with conflicting instructions. So that's number one. The second thing is that so I described sort of in the methodology section about saying that, look, one of the things that I want people to take away is to read that methodology section and say, this is what you should be doing, because actually this will make you a better cook. Because don't for a second believe that if I tell you that you need to exactly use this much of water, that it will work exactly like that, right? Because the kitchen, although I say it's a laboratory, it's not really a laboratory because the conditions vary. I live in Chennai, right? The temperature is like 30 degrees all through the year. The air pressure is different. The quality of rice and the quality of wheat you might use is different. The quality of water, whether it's hard or soft, may vary. And all of these things actually impact. And it's better you kind of apply that same methodology, right? And that methodology essentially is that every day I cook, right? I write down what I do. And I kind of have a broad sense of, this turned out well, this did not turn out well, right? I, as much as possible, I'm not saying everybody has to weigh everything they do, but have a broad sense, right? So I use slightly more water in making the puri dough, and this is how it turned out. I added slightly more oil in the puri dough, and this is how it turned out, and so on. Or I use saturated fat as opposed to vegetable oil, and this is how it turned out. So one is that I kind of document every day is like an experiment, what it sort of came. And that gives me a ton of sort of confidence to say, yes, this works and this does not work. So that's obviously the other one. And the third is obviously the fact that there is a ton of industrial food science academic published literature. So, so India, unfortunately, does not have a Kenji Alt Lopez or a Harold McGee that's focused on Indian cooking. That really breaks it down in a simple way. But the Indian Institute of Science and a bunch of others have a ton of published white papers. In fact, one of the things I talk about is how do you ferment idli, for instance. My source for that was actually this white paper that goes on to about 20-25 pages that describes the effect of the different water ratios, the different kinds of urad dal that you might use, the different kinds of rice you might use, how long do you ferment, how long do you soak, and how coarsely or finely do you grind it, and the impact of temperature and the amount of salt and so on. So it's just that that's not accessible to the average, the sort of reading public, because it's a scientific white paper, right? So it's all of these three that kind of go into, how I wrote this book.
This exactly. I mean, that the part about the idli has kind of like inspired me to do the experiment that you've suggested in it this coming weekend, is where you sort of like, ferment it for different periods of time, figure out your own ratios of like how much urad you want to use, how much rice, how much. So actually, and that is you saying that it came from a scientific white paper. But when I read it, I found myself chuckling, and there are lots of parts of the books which made me laugh, including that part which I would like to bring up at some point today, over the next sort of like half an hour, about how, about the vegetarianism and the not vegetarianism of eggs and milk, respectively.
Yes, so it's been a favorite sort of pet peeve of mine, but it's just good fun. But yes,
I could horrify large swaths of my Gujarati family by talking about that.
Yes.
But let me now sort of like describe the book, and I'd like you to read out a favorite passage so that we have a little context for the future question for the rest of the discussion. Yeah.
So in fact, I think my favorite section is probably the section I wrote about water. But then, so I'm going to keep that, as a surprise so that people can actually read it, because I had tremendous fun sort of writing it, because I think, that's the one bit in a sense of sort of left me with a sense of awe when you really go deep and understand that the thing that we are, we're mostly water, and everything that we eat is mostly water,
Yeah.
right? And this thing, this simple sort of oxygen and two hydrogen molecules, and what it does is just so magical in a way that other molecules simply have do not have that kind of effect at all. So I'll let you sort of readers read that. So maybe I'll read a couple of paragraphs from the chapter on onions and garlic, which I think in a sense that it's safe to say that 50-60% of Indian cooking starts off with heating oil and then frying onions, ginger, garlic, right? So it's universal, right?
Yeah.
Of course, there are religious restrictions. People may not eat that on certain days, and there are some communities that don't eat onions, ginger, garlic at all, and they replace that with asafoetida, which is again a funny hack because asafoetida has some of the same sulfurous flavor molecules that onion garlic has. So if the spirit of yours is to say that ginger, onion, garlic and onion are tamasic, and so I will not eat it, you should put asafoetida in the same category if that's what you mean. But religion, right? So anyway, so this is a chapter called Brown Baby Brown, which is sort of the topic that talks about the fact that literally all food is elevated in taste once it's golden brown in color, and you get it golden brown in color by heating it above 110 Celsius, right? Well above the boiling point of water, right? And so, in a sense, that the most common things that you're going to be browning are, a sense, typically your onions and then your potatoes and other kinds of things, right? And meat as well. So anyone who likes eating, and I'm confident that this constitutes a fair chunk of the world's population, knows that the magic color range for cooked food is the spectrum from golden to brown, right? From coffee to chocolate to freshly baked bread to fried chicken. The chemical process that imparts this color to food is also the one that transports ingredients to a plane of deliciousness, something that their unbrowned versions can only dream about. Right? French physician and chemist Louis-Camille Maillard was the first to describe what exactly was happening to the proteins and starches in the cooking vessel. It's been about 100 years, and we're still in the process of describing what happens when you cook food at temperatures above 110 Celsius. It is precisely this spectacular diversity of chemical reactions that lend the seemingly infinite range of flavors to food all around the world. So we shall begin exploring this magical browning reaction with the humble onion, right? As far as literary metaphors go, comparing people to onions is rather common. Onions have layers just like people and so on. But I have to break it to you that it's not a very good metaphor. For starters, food science tells us that the more flavorful and correspondingly more tear-inducing parts of the onion are the outer layers, not the inner ones. So the next time you chop onions, keep this in mind before carelessly discarding too many of the outer layers. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. We're standing in our kitchen, knife in hand, chopping board in place, with some onions contemplating their eventual slaughter. So, I kind of describe what exactly you're doing when you're actually cutting the onion. I go on to say that, how you cut it actually makes a difference. So if you cut them in large transverse pieces, it's a lot less intense than if you fine mince it and so on. How garlic paste is far more intense than, just garlic chopped into larger bits or used whole and so on. So it kind of goes into how you actually caramelize or, get a golden brown color, and why that's actually tremendously more tasty than just the, translucent onions and so on.
Yes, this book has like a plethora of techniques that seem unintuitive actually, and there are lots of sentences and paragraphs which might make you do a double take. So, like for example, you talk about how dough does not need kneading, and you talk about that in many ways you sort of like make us look at everyday ingredients in our kitchen, like from water to potatoes, with like new eyes. Yeah. Because if you start looking at it scientifically, you start questioning why you're doing what you're doing to it, right? Yeah. What's the word? Like, what is the biggest mistake that we make as Indians? I mean, what is the biggest sort of like misconception that we have? Or, I mean, if not one, like if you could name 2 or 3, the things that sort of like kind of horrify you about the way we cook.
I think, it's important to sort of recognize that most people who are seasoned cooks, I think it's wrong to say that they're doing it wrong. In many cases, and I kind of call it out in the book, that people often do the right things, but kind of attribute it to the wrong reasons. Yeah. and they still end up getting there. And there are sorts of things where they actually do the wrong thing, but somehow it produces the right outcome in a very narrow range of circumstances, like pressure cooking, right? Sort of measuring pressure cooking by whistles is one of my favorite examples, because it is one of those things that works only for your pressure pan, your pressure cooker on your stove at a specific heat setting and nothing else. If any of those things changes, your whistles will go for a toss, right? And yet 99% of all recipes on the internet, even if the person writing it would like to say, you know what, you need to pressure cook for 10 minutes after the first whistle, they will still say, no, well, my readers won't understand. Let me say 10 whistles, right? So it's just that I think there's one of the things about, as I said, as a result of us treating Indian cooking as this mystical, orally transmitted sort of art with the same kind of exoticism that unfortunately the West considers India to be. I think we're kind of doing ourselves in this sort of not too many favors here. But I think, so measuring rice cooking by whistles, I think, is one of the most common errors for beginners. And it regularly throws them off because young people, setting up homes now are more likely to have induction stoves and rather than a gas cylinder and a flame and so on. And by the way, induction stove, it puts out twice as much heat as your regular gas flame. And therefore, if you go by whistles, you'll get undercooked rice and dal. And so this is a very, 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 very common and often a fatal mistake because, you'll make a mess of your entire meal, right? The second thing, again, related to rice is the fact that you're estimating cups of water. So you're okay as long as you're making like small cups of rice, small amounts of rice, large amounts of rice. And if you linearly scale by cups, you're going to make, khichdi, right? So that is another common error, right? Another thing that I often find is people kind of really don't quite get how spices work, in the sense that they have this theory that the recipe says you have to add 1 teaspoon of this, 1 teaspoon of this, and you have to add it in this sequence, and that's when you get it right, without realizing that see, for example, turmeric and chili powder, you can add it anytime. You can add it even ahead of the camp, because for most part, the turmeric powder is really just giving you color. It's not giving you anything else. And the chili powder is giving you heat. And heat is something that does not get tamed with cooking, right? The capsaicin still stays around, right? On the other hand, more delicate spices are essentially fundamentally aroma. They are not taste at all. The taste of a cardamom is actually bitter. The aroma of cardamom is magic, right? And the fact that the later you add it in the cooking process, the more aroma you're going to get, because the rest of it is actually going away. Which is why we add spices at the start to oil, because then the oil is, because all these flavor molecules are dissolved in oil. They don't dissolve in water, right? So which is why you can add a ton of ginger. You can add a ton of ginger when you make tea, and it'll still be mild, right? Yeah. But try adding that ginger cooking it along with the milk, and the milk fat is going to dissolve a ton more of that ginger flavor, and you get really, really strong ginger tea, and you can actually make the ginger tea with a smaller amount of ginger. Right? Yeah. So likewise, I think, people buy these powdered spice boxes and they're getting oxidized, right? Aroma is getting lost every time it's at room temperature. So I think, so either you should use your freezer, refrigerate these kinds of things. And I think, there's lots of things. I think the eventual aim is not so much to find a specific fault, say, hey, you're doing this wrong. But to say, look, what you may be doing may work for you, but it's suboptimal. And by the way, if you do it this way, you might save time, you might save money. And by the way, you could apply it elsewhere as well. And it actually, you can get to be a lot more adventurous that way.
And this is the thing, is that you've sort of made connections on why things work, even though we've never actually questioned. We've just sort of accepted it as this is what I was taught. But now you're sort of like, teaching it. You're telling us why we're doing what we're doing and how to do it better, right? So you've been speaking a lot about food in the book, but it's also at the end of it is a science text, and it does feel very scientific in many parts of it, but science writing is hard. And it is said that the easier something is to write, the harder it was to write it, like the more work went to it. Yep. You've written a food book and a science book that does not sort of like make your eyes glaze over, as
Yep.
somebody who likes reading food books. Yep. It doesn't feel too sciencey. I mean, I get it immediately as somebody who's reading a a scientist who's reading it would enjoy the food bits as well without getting bored, right? A scientist is not interested in cooking. How did you balance these two things? Let's talk about the writing a little bit.
So it was, yeah, sure. I think it was I went through several drafts, right? So science writing per se is something that I'm very passionate about. Science writing and science communication. So in the sense that, I was always the kid in school who was asked to explain science to, say, junior school kids, when a teacher was absent, or to my relatives who may not have understood some complex physics or some of the mathematics in, say, class 9. And then, when I was in college, I would be called to go and explain things to them. So I kind of over time, in some sense, built a muscle for there's this popular sort of internet. So explain like I'm 5, right? So the idea of really explaining science to someone who may not understand some of the terms that you might use. So the idea is to not use terms that a non-science graduate may not understand, right? Or at max, just your high school knowledge should be enough. And I can take you through a very sequential step so which is why I think the hardest chapter to write was actually the first chapter. Because, to explain things like why certain materials work this way, why does metal heat up in a certain way, why does food cook slowly in an oven compared to, I literally had to get down to the level of atoms, right? And yet kind of really say that, look, imagine sort of heat flowing through molecules, sort of colliding with each other and so on. And it had to be explained without necessarily getting into like quantum thermodynamics and, those kinds of exceptions and things like that, but really just kind of explain. So science, in fact, when I set out to write this book and I was speaking to my editor, it was pretty early after the first couple of sort of chapters. She said, I think you should target this as a pop science book and target this to be in the science section of the bookshelf, not necessarily in the cooking section of the bookshelf, in the sense that somebody who reads this and has no interest in cooking can still learn and refresh a lot of their high school science through the lens of something that they see every day, which is cooking, right? So you could hate cooking, but I hope you can still understand how thermodynamics works, or some of the basic chemical reactions, and how water behaves, and how fats or oils behave. Is still useful even if you don't cook at all. So in that sense, I think the idea was to try and really target a reader who is not necessarily a science graduate, not necessarily has an engineering degree. I originally thought I'll write a book for nerds. Pretty quickly, I said no. I think that would have been easy to do. It would have been gratuitous. There would have been more jokes, more funny cartoons, and more jokes about quantum physics and all of that. But I think, we said, no, you know what? Let's target someone who actually enjoys it. So I did have my mother and a couple of other older people in the family and other friends that I knew constantly read chapters and say, did you get this? Right? At the last time you might have studied science might have been like 50 years ago, but do you still intuitively kind of get it? And is it just too sciencey, or am I tying it back to the practical knowledge of cooking? Is it kind of making sense to you? Are the connections being made making sense to you? So I think that's how I kind of play tested the entire thing. So that's what the writing process was like.
Which is, the thing is that this book feels like it's written for the pandemic also. And there are references to it. Like, you talk about oil and water sort of repelling each other, like somebody sneezed, coughed without a mask on.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so every page sort of like made me analyze what I was doing in the kitchen, understand it better. And sometimes even it made me question sort of like the techniques I'm using there, right? Yeah. It's crisp and it's easy, it's engaging. Like the thing is that how did you decide what to keep in the book and what not to keep? Because I want to ask you a little bit more about sort of like writing, because it's incredible that you write a food and a science book it's crisp, right? It's not a very thick tome. Yeah. Yes. Still, every page has so much stuff. How do you decide what to keep and what to not keep? I'm sure there's like enough for 5,000 pages.
Oh, yes. I think, that was so upfront, I kind of wanted to, I had a sort of word count in mind, and I wanted it to be around the 60,000 sort of word mark. And therefore sort of, and I kind of had a broad sense of the outline. So I really spent a lot of time on the outline. So because that helped me then sort of fine tune it down to things that I want to write about and things that I don't want to write about. And then for the outline, I started writing sub-chapter headings first. And I said that, look, if I'm going to go through, say, onions, right? So what are all the things that I want to talk about, right? And in that way, I think it helped me restrict it down to what I want to. And I also, as I use Scrivener, which tremendously helped me, because it constantly sort of it gives you, jump back into the sort of overarching view, if you will. And this is for people who write, and I think Scrivener is a fantastic tool. You can quickly jump to the outline. You can jump to your research in ways that you can't do that in like an MS Word and other things, right? So, and it constantly gives you a sense of analytics, and it gamifies the whole process. How many words did you write today? How many words did you write in the morning, and so on. And so it helped me kind of keep that focus. And I think because as I was writing this book, the kinds of books that I was researching, so this, for instance, right? So Harold McGee's, this is 1,000 pages, right?
Yeah.
His goal was leave nothing out.
Yeah.
I decided that he set out to write a textbook that essentially is a textbook in culinary institutes, right? Yeah. So I said, look, I don't want to do that, right? So I'm targeting a reader, and so therefore, so one was I spent a lot more time thinking about what to leave out than what to sort of leave in, and which is why that outline, and I really prioritize this by saying that, look, what's the thing that we most eat? So that's what's going to come first, right? So rice is going to come first, and then it's going to be wheat, then it's going to be vegetables, then it's going to be eggs, and then it's going to be meat, in that order, because that's how India rolls, right? And then really say, fine, I got the basics right, I got your heat sources and all of that right. Now what do people need to know, right? People need to understand where flavor comes from, right? And that essentially is, spices define Indian cooking, right? So essentially, again, even there, this is, there's a book called Neurogastronomy that literally gets into the details of how you actually experience flavor and how you can actually fool your brain. Like, for example, a strawberry flavored thing that's yellow in color will not taste like strawberry. Yeah. And things like that. So I realized that, no, I don't want to get into a gratuitous sharing of some of those fun facts and all that. But you know what? Primarily, what does a person need to know? That most of taste is actually aroma, right? Which is where when you have a cold, you can't taste food. And the taste is only just the 5 things that you can taste. You have sweet, salt, sour, bitter, and umami, right? And the other insightful thing that I learned from one of these books was the fact that you can only taste things that dissolve in water. You can only smell things that are dissolved in fats, right? So it is actually a completely sort of, it changes the way you think about it, right? And so therefore your tongue does very little work. Most of the work is actually done by your nose. And then kind of describing, what should I include in terms of the spices? How do you make spice mixes, right? I mean, we could go endlessly deep into the actual flavor molecules and what they bring to the table. So I actually read a book written, it's called, I think, I forget, I don't know if it's the Flavor Bible or one other book, was actually written by a chef and a perfume expert.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the book, but I think it's The Art of Flavor or something. So that person basically takes the perfumer's approach to combining contrasting similar kind of flavors and aromas, because at the end of the day, they realize that a lot of taste of food is just aroma, right? And so that was the spice chapter. And then obviously the next logical thing was, hey, how do you brown food, right? So because most food starts with onion, garlic, and all that. And when you deep fry something, you're browning it, and the Maillard reaction is absolutely important. And the real recognition that you can take any dish you have, and if you can brown stuff ahead of time and then add it to a gravy, it'll be tastier than if you just boil the whole thing in water, right? So, that sort of thing. Then obviously the idea of saying that acids, right? So inspired by Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, Samir Nosrat, fantastic book. So this idea of acids, and India is actually phenomenal in its diversity of acids, right? So in terms of amchur in the north, or anardana to vinegar in Goa, and which unfortunately it's a pity that the rest of India does not use vinegar as much, because it's a fantastically versatile acid, right? Especially if you get into these really good coconut vinegars and mango cider vinegars and apple cider vinegars and so on. And then you have obviously tamarind, yogurt, and all the rest of those acids, right? Yeah. And then the things about lesser. So the first half of the book was always aimed at things you probably knew about, but here's how I explained it better so you can kind of get it clear, the basics, right? Yeah. The second half of the book was aimed slightly more at things that you might not know, new things. Can I bring in sous vide? Can I bring in umami, right? Can I bring in these newer techniques like smoking and other things that you might not be very familiar with to add more flavor? How you can use your microwave more efficiently. There's a ton of pseudoscience about, microwaves are radiation and so on. So kind of, break that myth and so on. And then really kind of put it all together in terms of optimizing how your time in the kitchen, how you can, so there's this thing that Indian cooking is has to be done with fresh ingredients ground up, right? And this comes from this patriarchal culture of men demanding this and women, delivering it, right? And with no choice in the matter, right? It's surprising. So a lot of Indians, only when they become NRIs, discover the fridge and say, you know what, I'm going to store leftovers. I want to store basic gravies. I'm going to mix things, keep so I can, quickly put a lunch together. Otherwise, in India, some grandmother, some lady is slaving away from 6 a.m. in the morning to make ground up fresh food for everyone, right? Or a cook or someone, right? So that again was to say, can you take it to the next level? Can I actually learn? So that's where the whole restaurant. So I visited a ton of low-end restaurants to kind of understand what they do behind the scenes. To how do they make a dal makhani in 10 minutes? When it actually takes several hours to actually make it from scratch, right? So there are things that you can do. You can prep base gravies and freeze them. You can make spice mixes and freeze them. You can make flavored oils that you can use to improve flavor and so on. So I think that was the idea of that's where the software engineering comes in. You kind of talk about all the different algorithms for making rice for biryani, rice for pulao, or chapati, and so on. And that ultimately to put it all together was the final chapter. Yes.
So actually, well, in sort of like explaining this part of it, you've made my job easier. And you've already sort of like segued into the next two questions I had for you. One of which was to ask you, which food books do you like that you'd sort of like recommend? And, like which ones did you refer to? What's on your bookshelf? Do you read food books differently now that you've written one? Now that you've understood the science of it? That was the first part. The second part is actually to talk about the Flavor Bible and the Flavor Thesaurus. And about recent articles that have kind of pointed out how Indian food flavor combinations are so unintuitive, and they just they don't follow the Flavor Bible or the Flavor Thesaurus. To anybody, it should look like these flavors should not combine well, should not be delicious, and somehow they work.
They do, yes.
So if you could talk about like
it is.
books
So,
and that.
yeah, absolutely. So obviously, I think I did touch upon this was obviously the absolute Bible, if you will, and I think. This is again another favorite, again, huge, heavy book, but again, very recipe driven. I sometimes wish there was a little bit more science, beautifully explained, again, very humorous and so on. And then I think also Flavor Bible, Art of Flavor was another one. And I said, as I said, I really started reading a lot more of the food science white papers. They're not very interesting, but you get some insights that you would otherwise not get in a typical kind of a home cooking book, right? And obviously, I think the food science white papers end up being targeted at industrial food science people, for people who in the consumer food industry, right? I mean, if I have to make potato chips taste the same when I make like a billion packets, that's a different kind of problem, standardization problem that I have to solve. But there are still some optimization techniques and other things that they use. Obviously, in India, the word preservative is a bad word, and there is no food industry without preservatives and so on. So, those white papers were absolutely another source as well. I think more so than me changing how I read food science books, it has changed how I read recipes. In that I don't look at ingredient lists at all, right? I'm broadly kind of judging what's the overarching flavor layers of flavor here, right? What's the acid here, right? And what kind of fats am I using, and how am I layering these flavors, and where's the browning, or what's the strategy here, and essentially how is that whole thing being put together? And therefore, naturally, I don't really care about the ingredients, in the sense that broadly I know that this is probably going to be dominated by, say, a specific spice or a specific flavor. But if I don't have it, I'm not going to break a sweat, right? So I think that in some sense is very liberating. And one of the things that I would want readers to take away is to say, don't be overwhelmed by lists of ingredients. I can normally see that, since you mentioned that second question about Indian food, right? Indian food on average, right, you'll have like 20 ingredients per dish.
Yeah.
And you'll find like Italian food will be like 4 ingredients. And the taste of that depends on how fresh, how high quality those ingredients are. And if those ingredients are not great quality, that Italian dish will taste bad. On the other hand, a lot of Indian cooking, particularly urban Indian cooking, is in some sense over time evolved to figure out ways in which it can solve the problem of very poor quality produce. Large Indian cities, at least in the last 100 years, don't get great quality vegetables. You don't get great quality. I mean, everything that you get is actually pretty old, at least several, sometimes months, sometimes weeks old, right? In terms of where it comes from, where it's stored, then wholesale, and then it kind of gets to your supermarket and so on. Another non-intuitive sort of side here, frozen vegetables are fresher than fresh vegetables if you actually buy them in an Indian supermarket, at least. Unless you're growing your own vegetables, your vegetables that you buy from wherever are less fresh than frozen vegetables, because frozen vegetables are frozen pretty soon after being harvested. And at that point, so they're actually fresher. So sort of getting back to this, which is this idea that a lot of traditional food science, and that was one of the things when I read about a lot of those flavor books, the flavor Bible, flavor pairing, and so on, right? And I kind of see that, many of the things that they say do not go together seem to work in Southeast Asian, East Asian, and Indian cooking, right? And so clearly there seemed to be another way of thinking about this in terms of actually using opposing flavors, if you will, and kind of making it work. And I still don't know. I assume there's still ongoing research. This is still new research in terms of why this is the case and so on. But it's also safe to say that, like, for example, Japanese cooking is umami driven, in the sense that you create a very high umami broth that then allows you to get away with as minimal other ingredients as possible. You don't need to add a ton of spice. You don't need to add a ton of salt. You don't need to add a ton of other things. And because umami amplifies everything else and makes it linger and coats your tongue, it's actually good. So I would argue that a lot of South Asian cooking and Southeast Asian cooking is very fat driven. The basic idea is to get flavors of spices and all your flavoring ingredients into the fat. You start with fat, you end with fat. And so, whereas I think a lot of Western cooking is not necessarily that. It's your tadka and your ending tadka is not how you begin most dishes. There may be some things, but it's not it. There are many things that are completely baked. You add everything and you bake it together, and so on. So I think they're different. There are obviously different categories of dishes and so on. So in a sense, I think Indian cooking has the ability to truly surprise you with combinations that you did not think would work, especially with the diversity. And I'm also sometimes loath to condense everything into something called Indian cooking, right? It's like saying European cooking, right? So there's like a ton of sub-cuisines. There are millions of more sub-cuisines in India as well. And so many variations. And some areas that we've not even begun to scratch the surface, they're not very popular. Northeastern cooking of Northeast India, a lot more fermented ingredients that they use. And so on. So I think the sheer diversity here is just quite stunning.
Yeah, and it's I don't think anybody has really analyzed how flavor combinations work scientifically, because the kind of ingredients that we use in India are not used in this combination much further away from us, right? Maybe in the subcontinent, but not beyond that.
Yep. Actually, so just since you remind me, Ganesh Bagler is a professor at Indian Institute of IIIT. I think it's IIIT. So I did hear a talk, and he has a paper on flavor pairing rules in the Indian context. And it's actually quite fascinating. So he's put together that a good bit of research on that.
I actually went for his talk, and I think Garima Arora's Food Forward India had him come in and talk about this, and how he sort of like connected the dots in terms of like flavor molecules. So I mean, considering you're sort of like changing the way we think about a lot of things that we sort of like revere, right? Sit down with a silbatta and grind away, or like all those things. I mean, how has this book been received by I don't know, like your friends and family, people who cook very traditionally? When have you sort of like got people who may disagree with it look at it and give you their reactions?
Definitely. So obviously, I've been sort of so the book sort of comes out on December 14th, but obviously some people in my family have read it. And one more importantly, I think my family and friends have also been experiencing my cooking and my suggestions and so on for the last few years. It's a bit of both. I've been very conscious of also making sure, and this has also influenced the way I write as well, right? Is not to say you're doing it wrong, obviously, is to say that, hey, you know what? This is why it actually happens, but if you apply it here as well, it might work. Then obviously also there is some pseudoscience that kind of creeps in, and I often find that nutrition pseudoscience more than anything else ends up interfering with cooking, and that's unfortunate, right? I mean, food science is still reasonably well settled. There's not too much doubt about it. Nutrition, on the other hand, is not settled science. The reason why there's a new diet every month is because it's not settled science. There's no new Newton's laws for the last 300 years, on the other hand, right? Because so that's that, people have to look at a lot of nutrition advice and say, you know what, one, it may not work for me. because nutrition is highly individual, highly personal, and people end up making general rules about things that may not affect them at all. And two, sometimes they don't have the scientific temper to realize that, for example, people drinking ginger water and turmeric water all through the COVID pandemic, they're going to end up thinning their blood.
Yeah.
They go into surgery. Surgeons are actually saying that, hey, you know what? Hey, this is something that we have had to add to our protocols. 2 weeks before you come for the surgery, please do not drink turmeric water and so on. Right?
Yeah.
So the pseudoscience part is sometimes where people disagree. It's been very hard for me to convince people that baking soda, which is something that I'm particularly very closely attached to. I have a very specific section on baking soda, that it's an absolutely magical thing in the kitchen if you know how to use it. It can save you time and effort. It can help you cook legumes faster. It can brown your chicken much better. It can tenderize meat better, especially when you make these Southeast Asian meat dishes and so on. And at the end of it all, it'll help you clean the kitchen as well, right? And it deodorizes your fridge. I mean, there's no single thing that does more things than baking soda. But I know, the force is very strong in terms of no, baking soda is bad. And it's obviously because, I think low-end restaurants end up slightly overusing it. Obviously they do, to save on cooking fuel costs when they're cooking dal at large scale and so on. But I think, MSG is another favorite topic of mine. People simply will not use even the tiniest amount of MSG. I'm telling them that, this Parmesan cheese you ate has more MSG than the quarter teaspoon of MSG that you're going to add. This tomato pickle that you just had is going to have a ton of glutamates. Like mushroom has inosinate and glutamates as well. So, but yes, it's just that some of this stuff is still there. But it's as long as they kind of start thinking about it, I think over time, I think people will change.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, I think sugar is more processed than MSG, and sugar is much worse for you. And in a way, it was extracted from plants simply to make our food tastier. Similarly, somewhere, somehow, somebody realized that MSG is what's giving the savoriness, and a lot of our food has it. So why not keep it as an add-on?
You don't have to use it every time, but I mean, it does help. I mean, if you're making some kind of pulao or fried rice, it really just amps the whole thing up, especially if you're a simple jeera pulao. With a little bit of MSG, it's just quite magical, right? And again, so MSG, for instance, because umami tends to amplify other tastes, right? You can get away by adding lesser amount of salt if you add a tiny pinch of MSG, which is good for you, by the way, right? And MSG, because it's also sodium, and again, this other non-intuitive thing, right? That saltiness is essentially your tongue detecting sodium. Yeah. So all sodium salts are salty, right? Yeah. To varying degrees. Sodium chloride happens to be the saltiest, and so we use it. So monosodium glutamate is also salty, only 1/3 is salty. But umami actually more than makes up for the effect that it has. And the other part of it actually comes from natural sources. It's there in your body. By the way, you have a human being on average has 2 kgs of glutamates. The amino acids that make up the proteins in your body, you have 2 kgs of glutamates. A 1/4 teaspoon more is not going to hurt you.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to ask you one last question before I open it up to our audience. This is, you've started a conversation about Indian food. You've started a discussion that challenges us, tells us about how we don't need to worry so much about tradition and authenticity, but instead understand the reasons why we've done things the way we've done them. How do you like this conversation to continue? And considering you have so much stuff that you had to leave out, is it too early to ask about a second book?
Not really. Not really thought about it yet. But I think there is, in some sense, even before a second book, my optimistic hope is at a bare minimum level. I want to give people a series of a different language to speak about food, a more precise, easy to transfer knowledge way of describing what you're doing, which I think, unfortunately, not all recipes do. My favorite example is cook tamarind till the raw smell goes away. Is the classic example of not useful knowledge, in that it's not something that another person can truly understand, because that other person has no way of smelling the paper and saying, is that what raw tamarind smells like, right? It is. So therefore, the reason behind saying that, the reason you want to think of tamarind as an acid or for you to understand pH is I want you to taste it. And it's easy for me to say, please cook the tamarind till it's as sour or as less sour as you like it. That's really what it is. If you want it super sour, then don't cook it for long, right? And if you want it to mute it down, then cook it for longer. And then figure out for you is does 6 minutes work or does 8 minutes work or 10 minutes work is entirely up to you. And then the amount of tamarind you add and so on, right? And likewise, have a sense of, vinegar is pretty sour, right? Lime juice is also pretty sour. Where yogurt, not as sour, not always as sour. Tomatoes, complete lottery. Sometimes they can be sour, depending on the season, they may not be sour and so on. It's essentially also saying that one, if I have an accurate, stop writing recipes in terms of say whistles. Don't necessarily give replacement ingredients for some of the fancy stuff, right? Don't make it seem like if you don't add this, then please, it's not authentic, it's not, etc. If you use another kind of fat instead of shuddh desi ghee, milk from a cow in Punjab, it's not dal makhani, is not useful for anyone. It should be okay for somebody in Kerala to make dal makhani with coconut oil. It may taste different, but it's okay. I mean, it'll still be delicious. It doesn't really matter, right? I think it's just that at the bare minimum, I want people to start using a slightly more simpler scientific form of language to describe recipes, so it makes a lot of knowledge actually get written down in a lot more easier way that actually spreads the knowledge around, right? So in the sense that the intent is to say, please write more recipes, but write them in more scientifically accessible ways, right? And then try and document a lot of these other rare, about to die off cooking techniques from parts of India that don't get too much attention. Could be fermentation techniques, could be rural India, specific things that people might do with specific rare ingredients, specific new styles of cooking and so on, which again, the typical urban industrialized typical restaurant style food and and all of that is going to end up like in the same way in the West, Punjabi food is Indian food. I think even within India, we are kind of restricting ourselves to documenting a certain very specific kind of urban cooking, urban middle class cooking. And I think there's tons of stuff to be written about how do people with very few means, how does, say, for example, a fisher folk generate a tremendous amount of flavor with little or no ingredients by using dry fish, which have a ton of glutamates and inosinates and so on, right? So it's just that I think there's a huge opportunity to really start writing about the science of Indian cooking by others, not just me, right? And I think that is in some sense my hope as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's our introduction to the science of Indian cooking has been so enjoyable that I'd love to sort of I think you've sort of whet our appetite, so to speak, for more research, more scientific research into Indian food. I mean, following you on Twitter is a delight. It's the most fun. Like sometimes I'll just go and read the last 3 days and, want to sort of find out more from just little things that you've mentioned. It's fantastic. And I'm gonna actually, there are a bunch of questions waiting for you. I'm going to start asking them. So we have Manorama asking us, how does cooking in cast iron or other metals affect the taste? Is it composition or is it the prices? Yeah, but is it the composition? So
cast iron is, so the two, one is that unseasoned cast iron will react with your food, especially if it's acidic. And most things we cook will be acidic to some degree or the other. In fact, most food that we eat tends to be on the sourer side, in the sense that it's not on the base or the basic side, right? So it's mostly acidic, right? Anything with tomatoes, anything with yogurt, anything with lime juice, anything with tamarind, all of this stuff will react with the iron. And those iron salts will get mixed. It's fine. It's not dangerous, but it'll taste metallic for most part. So unseasoned cast. So typically when cast iron is sold, it has to be seasoned. Either you get it pre-seasoned or you'll have to learn how to season it. And once you season it, you'll have to learn how to keep that seasoning afresh once in a while. And that takes a little bit of learning. It's not too hard. And so if you ask me, what's the advantage of cooking in cast iron? It's just that it's heavy and it retains a ton of heat. So once you kind of, apply a certain amount of heat, it will retain that heat for a long period of time, right? So that has some interesting cooking properties in that sense. So for most part, I think it's a matter of convenience. So anything to do with, it's more nutritious if I cook on cast iron, all of that is pseudoscience. it is fundamentally is about the fact that it transfers heat and it retains heat. That's fundamentally it, and it has to be seasoned, which is why about 100 years ago we invented stainless steel. You get all the advantages of cast iron with none of the disadvantages, right? Obviously, that one disadvantage with stainless steel is that food sticks to it. Unlike seasoned cast iron, which kind of behaves like a non-stick surface. If you maintain it really well, right? So you can cook eggs and not have the egg, and try cooking an omelette on a stainless steel pan. It's just a mess, right? Which is why people end up buying non-stick. And the problem is that actual non-stick surfaces don't last very long, and we end up using very high amounts of heat. So the surface does not last very long. Both the Teflon itself, as it starts peeling off, it's not good for you. Even the ceramic non-stick ones, much more expensive, but the ceramic doesn't last at all, right? It kind of scrapes away very, very quickly. So I think in that sense that there is no specific advantage per se to cast iron, other than specifically this. You might want to pay attention to making sure that you know how to season it and keep it seasoned.
Yeah. Okay. There's actually an entire section in the book about the properties of different sort of cooking materials and metals that we use. That it's basic. It does basically to cooking equipment the same thing that it does to ingredients. Is you go into your kitchen and suddenly you start seeing all sorts of things in there that you had never seen before.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating how sometimes people in India, a lot of people, I don't know about North India, but at least South India, people have a thing against aluminum, right? They think that, aluminum is bad.
Toxic.
It's true. It's true in the sense that aluminum has the same problem of leaching food into if you're using very acidic ingredients and so on. But trust me, the restaurant industry entirely aluminum based for no reason other than the fact that it is phenomenally a great conductor of heat, and all food in restaurant is cooked at high temperatures in a very short period of time. And aluminum is just perfect for that. You're not going to have too much of a risk there. And by the way, they discard those pans like literally, very regularly. And so essentially, so it's so you might want to think about that as
well. So thank you. Sonal asks, what is the source of better food? I think what she means is a better sort of surface to cook food on, induction or a hob. Which one is better?
It's again a horses for courses, right? It depends on what you're cooking. I would actually say that about 80% of all the cooking that I do ends up being on an induction stove, specifically because I have mine connected to a solar panel on my terrace. So, so therefore it's free. So it's free energy for me. So I use induction stuff. But that said, there are some things like, for example, baking a chapati where you still need to put it directly on the flame. You can't do that on an induction. That's number one. And also a flame actually gives you slightly finer control. Induction is like either it's like barely warm and the next setting will burn your food, right? So there's sometimes a problem with at least the cheaper induction stuffs. So I would generally say that there's no betterness to this. It's for you to understand how each of this works, right? So a flame works by literally heating the bottom of your pan, and then the pan heats your food, right? In an induction stove, there's no contact surface heat at all. In fact, the induction stove won't be hot at all, right? Yeah. It's actually electromagnetic induction from inside the coils that heats up your pan directly, which is why you can only use like iron or metal or anything that's magnetic. So you can only use steel or iron, cast iron on an induction stove. You can't use like copper or aluminum or any of those other things that will not work on an induction stove. So it also depends on, you can't use ceramic, for instance, or earthenware and those kinds of things on an induction stove because it will not heat for at all, right? So it has to be induction ready. So it's a question of horses for courses. I would actually say that, see, there is your gas flame that you might need to use in very specific scenarios like flame grilling and so on. But for anything that's being cooked on top of inside a vessel, an induction stove is as good. You don't need to worry about it at all, right? Again, deep frying better kadais are actually concave, and concave things you can't place on an induction stove. It has to be flat. And a flatter surface essentially means you end up having an edge, and then you end up having to use more oil and things like that. So that way, deep frying I tend to do on a typical hob, if you will. But again, in other situations, you'd use a microwave and also a regular oven as well. And nowadays, obviously, an air fryer, which is essentially an oven. So,
just a smaller, faster oven, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just a convection oven that's smaller, so it's quicker and faster.
Yeah. Okay, so Shweta asks us, in Ayurvedic cooking philosophy, a combination of the 6 tastes is supposed to be the most satiating to the human palate. How can one achieve that through chemistry of food? I'm guessing, is there like a scientific basis to that, or is there sort of like, has that come from science, or is it?
So here's the thing, right? So a lot of traditional wisdom, and this is briefly discussed in the book, not specifically in the context of Ayurveda. And this is a larger, I guess, a more philosophical point about knowledge in general, right? There's knowledge that has essentially come over a long period of time, passed on by constant experimentation day in and day out in people's homes, and passed on from mother to daughter and so on over time, right? So this is, in some sense, this is knowledge that has stood the test of time, right? I mean, if at some point something didn't work, it would have gotten lost. So simple evolutionary rule, survival of the fittest. So sort of, so there's genes and this is memes essentially. So mimetic sort of evolution, if you will, right? So that's how ideas tend to work over time, and cooking is very similar to that. A lot of natural medicine, medicinal systems, be it Ayurveda, be it Siddha, be it Unani, be it whatever traditional medicinal systems, China and so on. All of these are examples of essentially people observing what works, what does not work, not necessarily always writing stuff down, but again, passing it on over time and so on, right? Now, there are both advantages and disadvantages to this. One is the fact that clearly there are parts of Ayurveda that essentially say, if you have this problem, you try this herb, it's going to give you some relief, probably has been tested for thousands of years. Probably work, right? And in all likelihood, what we end up finding is that that plant essentially has the same active ingredient that is also used in the drug that we now manufacture synthetically and so on. So, hey, you know what, it seems to cure and so on. But I think what is often missing is the fact that many of these traditional methods sometimes resist going through a formal double-blind scientific sort of testing. Right? And I really wish we do that for Ayurveda, in the sense of being able to figure out what bits of Ayurveda are actually, you know what, this checks out, versus this, not really sure. I don't know, it might have worked somewhere at some context in the past, but maybe they talked about a different plant, or maybe they talked about... And sometimes, other thing to remember is that in many of these traditional systems, you classify things based on your level of understanding at that point of time. I'll give you a very simple example, right? In astrology or astronomy, Rahu and Ketu exist as planets because we didn't have telescopes, but they needed a model to explain eclipses. And so to explain eclipses, because we didn't know it was actually the Earth or the Moon coming in between, we had to invent these planets to make the model work so that our calculations came out right? But after Newton and after everyone else, now we know that eclipses are caused this way, then we don't need Rahu and Ketu anymore, right? They are fictional at that point. A lot of the categorization of things like tastes and et cetera, are very similar, in that they were made at a time when we didn't know about molecules, when we didn't know about how aroma works and all of this. They were actually done by day-to-day experimentation or observation. And sometimes you require modern understanding to be able to see if those categories are still valid, right? So my simple answer to you is that it's hard to say. I would actually say that it's perfectly safe to follow. I think, because it's worked for so long. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it can be explained by modern science, because we haven't researched it yet.
It's I think a lot of sort of like things that passed down was handed to us, and we were sort of like told this is how it works. Don't ask why. Yeah. Because yes, it was too complicated to get into the why, and now we're sort of like going back to the why, right? Like now we're beginning to understand why we had our turmeric lattes.
So they didn't have the means to give an answer to why either, right? So it's not like they had electron microscopes or pipettes or burettes and others, right? So they had to go with whatever limited, just their eyes and noses, and that's fine. So you can build a model of the world with the limited senses you have, but you can build a more detailed model of the world if you have more tools, and that's essentially where we are now.
Yeah, originally it was just empirical, right? Like we just empirically this works, and
which is why I'm sort of I'm usually critical of people who are like, oh, all of that old stuff is bullshit. I'm very wary of that, because one of the things that Nassim Nicholas Taleb says, that sometimes ancient wisdom that has stood the test of time is far more likely to be accurate than a poorly built scientific model based on bad peer review and a dubious journal somewhere. And you say, no, this is scientific, and that's nonsense. I think that's fallacious as well, right? I think you have to go into it with an open mind and really see if you can, validate it for yourself.
Yeah. Sorry, we have like about 10 minutes more, so I'm going to go through the next three or four
Sure.
questions really quickly.
Yeah.
Hema's asking about if a recipe says salt to taste, we use our hand to put salt over the dish while cooking it without using a spoon. Does this
Yep.
make a difference? What is the sort of like the does the tactile use of salt,
Yeah.
affect?
So so it is tactile memory is a very powerful learning mechanism for human beings in general, right? It's because we have tactile memory that we can play musical instruments, that we can do all the paintings and so on, and the same thing applies to cooking as well, right? So my grandmother or my mother would leave the spoon and simply reach for the hand, simply because she has that memory of exactly how much is just right? If you have not done it for thousands of years, then you don't have that tactile memory. So remember that, right? And so I think one of the things I attempt to demystify here is when it particularly comes to salt, right? It's possible to really just, if you're a beginner, right? Over time, you'll kind of build a muscle for it. You'll kind of know. So people will often, in their salt box, they will keep the same size spoon, because if that spoon changes, then all my calculations go for a toss, right? So people will always do that, right? And again, and they do this because there is no rescuing something that's over salted. Okay? So that's the problem, right? So it's a one-way street.
Not even the little atta ball.
So atta ball actually just absorbs the whole gravy. So you'll just be left with less gravy. It'll still be as salty. Okay? You can make it less salty by adding more water, which will dilute your this thing. So that's about it. Right?
Yeah, it'll dilute.
So essentially, it's a question of that, right? So if you don't have that experience and tactile memory over decades and so on, then you may not have it. So you're okay to build that memory or use a spoon if you so wish it. It's harder you can build a tactile memory for that spoon and that amount, right? You can get a sense of, for this amount, this is perfectly fine. But I attempt to demystify by saying that in general, at least the guys who do industrial food science, right? They can't do andaza wala salt and all that, right? They need percentages by weight, because every chip and every biscuit and every one of these things has to taste exactly the same. And so in general, food science tells us that this varies by cultures. Western people have much less of a tolerance for salt than Indians do. Indians eat a tremendously salty food. So in general, 1 to 1.5% by weight is a useful starting point. I know it's hard. You might actually literally have to kind of get a sense for weights, but you can do that actually. See, because most of the weight of your dish is water. Remember that. So if you kind of build a memory of saying that in my dish, this much, if you can kind of weigh that much amount of water and kind of build that memory saying that this is about half a kg of food. This is a quarter kg of food, not like down to the 10 grams, at least at quarter kg, half kg, or 3/4 of a kg of whatever it is you're cooking. Estimate 1 to 1.5% is the starting point. You'll be fine. And then if you want more, you can always add more. So in general, I've experienced that 1.5 to 2% is what Indians tend to find, okay, reasonably seasoned. And if you're old, you should go much less, 1 to 1.5 and so on. And again, also the reason for this is also the fact that our saliva is also salty, by the way, right? So any food that has less than 0.4% of salt will taste unseasoned, because it has to be more than the amount of salt in your saliva for it to register as being salty. Because otherwise your tongue is used to the base level of saltiness that's already there in your saliva. So anything more is what you need. So 1 to 2% seems to be that range where you need to add salt. But to do that, you need to first build a way to estimate weights without, I don't think carrying a weight and weighing everything is practical. But remember that most of what you cook is water. So if you can estimate weights of water by looking at how much water there is, then you're pretty much estimating the weight of food.
Thank you. There's actually a question that makes a lot of kind of us wonder why things like meat curry or pulao, or in my case, like for me, Sindhi curry or like pav bhaji taste better the day after they're made. Like, and some things taste amazing fresh, like chutney.
Yes. So cooking is a process that literally starts well before you actually get to the stuff, right? So it starts when you cut your vegetables. So enzyme reactions start the moment you actually damage any kind of plant tissue, right? So which is why actually you cut onion a little ahead and it'll start to smell, sort of slightly funny, right? And so therefore cooking starts well ahead, right? And cooking is not just the application of heat, even acids can actually cook. So when you marinate something, you're actually cooking it as well. And then there's the cooking process itself. And remember that after you take it off the stuff, cooking is still continuing. right? Because it takes time for the temperature to come down and so on. And obviously, given that these are very, very phenomenally a massive number of chemical reactions that are going, it's safe to say that dishes that have a lot of ingredients uh, tend to generally mellow down and taste better the next day. Fish curries, meat gravies, and so on, because the meat, for instance, is something that cooks at a much lower temperature than vegetables, right? So 60 Celsius, right? So which is why you can eat a steak at like 52 Celsius, like, rare steak and so on. So it is, so meat continues to cook for a fair amount of time and continues to react with acids in your food. And so essentially, it's hard to predict which categories of dishes will taste better. But certain kinds of complex gravies, especially meat-based gravies, tend to taste better after a while.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's look at the next one. Why is drinking water with a higher pH considered healthier?
I'm not sure. So drinking water with a higher pH, for starters, is going to taste bitter because anything basic, the word acid literally means sour in Latin, right? So, so anything opposite is bitter. So I have seen, in general, a lot of the alkaline, you need to eat alkaline food, alkaline water, and all of that is pseudoscience as far as I can see right now. But if somebody points me to a good white paper that kind of explains why drinking alkaline water is good, other than in situations when you have indigestion and you have sort of high amounts of acidity and you need to neutralize it, that's the time when you drink high pH water, which is also called an antacid, right? So that's essentially the only situation where you're actually drinking to neutralize. But when you're not having high levels of acidity in your stomach and you drink something basic, one, it's not going to taste great, and two, there is no proven benefits unless somebody would like to point me to something. So always happy to change my opinion on it.
Yeah. Okay. What is a scientific reaction that takes place in everyday Indian cooking that would surprise most people?
Actually, I would rather surprise you with the one reaction that does not happen, but you think it happens. Okay. So that is a far more fun fact to learn. So when you deep fry something, you're imagining that the fat is actually reacting with the food. It's not. Will it blow your mind if I tell you that the fat is playing the same role that water is playing, except at a higher temperature? The fat is there, the oil is there to transfer heat evenly to whatever it is you're frying. Because water boils at 100 Celsius, oils, etc., tend to smoke at more like 200 Celsius. Yeah. So in the Maillard reaction range between 110 and 175, you at the higher end towards 175, 180 is when you can deep fry. Deep fry is basically instant Maillard reaction and dehydration of the outer surface. So all the water on the surface escapes, so it becomes brittle and crisp, and therefore it browns evenly, and the fats are doing absolutely nothing there other than transferring heat, right? Because if you put it directly on the stove, on the vessel, the metal will only transfer heat only to that surface that is currently, and it will transfer it unevenly. See, both cast iron and stainless steel are very uneven transferers of heat. So some parts of the pan will be hot and some parts of the pan will not be hot. So the reason we use a cooking medium like an oil is so that the heat gets transferred completely evenly, right? So deep frying involves no chemical reaction of the oil itself. What is undergoing the chemical reaction are the proteins and sugars outside that are actually combining to form the Maillard reaction, get that brown coating and the delicious taste, and also lose all the water so it becomes crisp. Yeah. And because it becomes crisp, it becomes opaque so that the oil doesn't go inside and then make your food greasy. Which is why if you fry food at a lower temperature oil, the oil is actually going to go inside. And then your food is going to get greasy, because what will happen is it's not crisping fast enough. So it's going to be porous and the oil is going to go inside. So if it's just at the right temperature, which is 175 to 180, if I ask you to do one thing in your kitchen that will improve your cooking skills, get a temperature gun and deep fry precisely between 170 and 180. And trust me, you'll never mess up any pakoda, any kind of puri ever again. And people get very nervous about deep frying, right? So.
Yeah, which is why now we have air frying, right? Because that's basically what it's doing. It's just
The only difference is that in deep frying, oil is transferring the heat. In air frying, it's the air. And air is a very inefficient way of transferring heat, and it transfers it very slowly, right? And it takes a lot more time, and the insides of the food end up getting dehydrated a lot more, right?
Yes.
So that is why. So when you deep fry something, the insides are still juicy and succulent, while the outside is crisp. You can't get that in an oven, because the oven, convection oven or an air fryer, is going to dehydrate a fair bit of the food. You're going to get something that's significantly drier from a mouthfeel standpoint.
All right. Ishita Roy says, hi, I enjoy your tweets thoroughly. Fun meets information. I have two questions, if I may. I'm so curious about complementary foods, not wine and cheese, but which vegetables cook well together and which ones don't. Do you have any insights about that?
I think it's a very long answer, if you will. So in general, with vegetables, right? The thing to keep in mind is cooking rates, right? Rather than which go together per se, because vegetables per se are not very high on flavor, except obviously unless you consider garlic, ginger, and all of that. Your typical starchy vegetables and green vegetables, etc., have mild amounts of flavor. So you can literally combine anything you want, but the trick to combining them is to, one, understand at what temperatures they tend to cook, right? So for example, something like a cucumber and potato will cook at vastly different rates, right? Cucumber, you don't even need to cook, although you can make cucumber sabji and all that, right? So in those situations, if you can cook them separately and then mix them at the end, then there's literally no combination that will not work. I think, we said, Roshni actually said ahead, right? Indian food is filled with these kind of odd combinations. So there are no rules here at all. Yeah. But be aware of whether something will cook a little ahead. Like, for example, even when you're cooking multiple, like for example, a mixed vegetable curry and so on, you have to pay attention to the sequence. So you put potatoes first because it takes the longest time to cook. You might add carrots. So in general, starchy vegetables first, greener, softer kind of vegetables, and leaves pretty much at the last, right? In fact, the longer you cook leaves, the more bitter they're likely to become. In fact, if you want to prevent greens from actually getting bitter, you might want to first blanch them in hot water, take them off, and then do whatever you want with it, because that will deactivate the enzyme that causes that bitterness, right? So I think, you can combine anything as long as you know at what rates they cook.
Yeah, well, and there is so much in Indian food that actually completely does not follow that. For example, like Indian side bhaji, everything's just sort of like tossed into the pressure cooker and cooked. Three types of greens, a whole bunch of starchy vegetables, a whole bunch of lentils, and we just like throw it in and cook it. And it's pretty good. And then there's pav bhaji, of course. I mean, pav bhaji is again like cooked endlessly and mashed, and every kind of vegetable, everything goes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A fascinating bit of history there too, right? I mean, it was invented as a dish to kind of use up potentially marginally spoiled vegetables. So you cook it to death with a ton of butter so that you can't detect any of those potentially bad smells that might come and so on. So that's the origin, because it was originally made as something for mill workers and so on. So a lot of Indian cooking also has a ton of these interesting stories behind them, a lot of social history as well, right?
Yeah, and frugality and like times of like, drought and famine and all of that. And like,
absolutely.
Ishita Roy's other question is, I wanted to ask something I've always wondered. Does most of Indian cooking involve overcooking food? And how does that work for our nutrition? You just said that it's not a settled science, but still.
Yeah, well, I'm very wary. So one of the things I often tell people is that please do not ask someone without a nutrition degree questions on nutrition. You should not take my answer or anybody who does not have a nutrition degree's answer as the gospel truth. And also remember that doctors are not nutritionists. Nutritionists are nutritionists. So it's important that people understand that this is a very evolving, constantly evolving space. But overcooking, independent of nutrition. So in general, as a general rule, cooking improves the nutrition of what you eat in many cases. Cooked carrots are actually give you more available nutrients than raw carrots. Yeah. Cooked tomatoes give you more vitamin C, give you more nutrients, the nutrients that it has. They make it available to the body than say raw ones, right?
Yeah.
Fermented foods give you more available vitamin B and other things than unfermented foods, and so on. So that's one general rule that you can kind of remember. But overcooking by itself, yes, definitely overcooking can destroy certain micronutrients, but not to the levels that you're going to really worry about, right? The reason it's called a micronutrient is you need a very tiny amount of it. It's over a week's period, you're going to get most of it, as long as you have a pretty diverse diet. I mean, if you cook the same three things and you overcook it, and you essentially don't eat a diverse diet, then you have a problem. Otherwise, I think it's mostly not a problem. There is indeed the problem of overcooking in a lot of Indian cooking, particularly when it comes to meat. That is something that I have definitely seen. I have, for instance, after developing a taste for soft-boiled eggs in Southeast Asia, Japan, and other parts of the world, I find Indian most boiled eggs to be just boiled to death, as in like boiled to the point where the hydrogen sulfide reacts with the iron in the yolk to get that green deposit you get around the yolk, which is ferrous sulfide. I mean, you get that only when the egg is overcooked. So if you see that green deposit, you know it's overcooked, right? So I think it also comes from the fact that cooking meat in India has always been a very risky thing because of no refrigeration. You don't know if it's harboring bacteria. So nobody's taking a risk undercooking meat. And unfortunately, meat cooks at a very low range of low temperatures, which is just barely above the temperature that you actually need to cook anything to kill all bacteria. Unfortunately, that's the case. So which is why certain kinds of white meat almost always end up being too overcooked and chewy. Chicken almost always is overcooked in India. Which is why I often say that you need to learn the technique of brining, so to actually account for overcooking. So if you brine your meat, then you can overcook it a bit, and it'll still be reasonably succulent, and so on. So that's there in the book.
I don't know what I enjoy more, listening to you talk about the things that I've read in the book or reading the book. It's so fascinating. Everything's and it's really like reading the book is like listening to Krish talk as well, but without the audio. All right. Is it true that curcumin in turmeric is released at a certain flash point? Hence, it should be put in hot oil tadka rather than just sprinkling it on the sabzi.
No such thing. So you're gonna. So most things that are there inside what you eat, trust me, your body is phenomenally good at extracting every little bit from most things, right? We have 300 million years of mammalian evolution to thank that we extract every last molecule, barring the ones that we absolutely cannot digest. That's usually fiber. That's usually, herbivores do that as well, right? But we don't digest certain kinds of starches, certain kinds of cellulose, heavy cellulose, and so on. But everything else, we extract everything. So I don't know that there may be some new research that I'm not aware of. But the way I see it, you run the risk of burning your turmeric if you put it in too hot an oil. So if you are putting turmeric into the oil, make sure the oil is not too hot, right? And keep the oil reasonably well under 110 Celsius so that you're not sort of burning the turmeric per se. So otherwise, you're going to get the curcumin one way or another. So you're okay.
All right. Is Manorama Prakash is asking, is rock salt better or saltier? I really want you to talk about this.
So this is something every time I have an interview about the book, right? And one thing I almost always predict, that 50% of the questions will not be about cooking, but it'll be about nutrition. And this is true. I think we conflate nutrition and cooking because we are serious about our health, and I think that's a good thing. But I just wish there was better science, well settled science on nutrition to really answer some of this. Very specifically on a rock salt, right? I hate to break it to you. There are no nutritional benefits you get out of any kind of salt. Salt is salt at the end of the day. The other nutrients, the other things that are there in the salt are there in such tiny amounts that they are, for all intents and purposes, a bit like homeopathy. It's too diluted for you to get any good out of it. In a sense that it is, so you can get flavor, right? So your kala namak is an example, because the sodium sulfide and the hydrogen sulfide give you that flavor, that eggy flavor that you get from chaat masala. Therefore, as a result of kala namak, you get flavor. but nothing else. And so those minerals are not going to make a difference at the concentrations they are in. If there were any more of it, then the salt will taste bad. So you're not going to be able to eat it. And at which point, it's not going to be useful. Right? So.
Is drinking water from copper jugs good for you?
This is copper is another a common source of pseudoscience. Copper again, copper is quite reactive, right? And it's I would actually be wary. There are some copper salts that are actually toxic. So it depends on what alloy. I think people have been using brass and bronze and copper vessels for a long time. I think in small amounts should be okay, but there's no per se scientific evidence on whether, at the end of the day, it's water. Okay? It's very simple. And whatever little bit that's going to get dissolved from the copper and form some kind of, cuprous hydroxide or, whatever's dissolved salt in that is going to be in such a small concentration that you're going to get more of it from the food you eat, right? Your bananas have more potassium than most other sources. And some of that potassium in your banana is also radioactive, by the way. Right. So in fact, there's this joke that if you eat enough bananas, right, I think it's some several thousand kgs of bananas, so you can actually get radiation damage and so on, right? So there's that joke. But anyway, long story short, be aware of concentrations so that you can actually make better choices, right? Many of the purported advice, ask yourself a very simple question. How much of that micronutrient am I actually getting from doing this? And if it's statistically insignificant, you're probably getting nothing from it. So you're probably getting it much more from other food sources anyway.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, again, it came down through history, and everybody said that you should drink water out of copper, and it reduces like the speed at which you age, and it makes you a little bit slightly immortal. I don't know what it is.
See, it's very possible that most people were drinking very unsafe sources of water. Without purification, without filtering, filled with diseases that could, 100 years ago, kill you. Okay. And so clearly, I think I did remember reading that it's possible that copper has a slight antibacterial effect. And so I think, it kind of people got used to that. But then over time, right, the problem is that, we end up adding all other benefits beyond that original reason, which sometimes can be lost. Right? Yeah. Because today you're probably eating reverse osmosized water coming out of your tap and then putting that in a copper vessel. I don't think you're going to get much.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think, why, if you speak to Kurush Dalal, he says why human beings started drinking beer and tea is because chances of boiling water and making a tea stain from it reduce the chances of you getting disease.
Exactly.
And so then similarly beer, because water by itself was not considered pure, but like beer. And again,
alcohol, right? Alcohol is antibacterial. Alcohol will kill most life. And you would rather drink beer than die from dysentery in the Middle Ages, right? So
and it's also, I mean, now the virus that shall not be named dies in like 4 hours, I think, on copper. So
we're sort of seeing all misinformation spreads. We're seeing that in a sort of hyper fast version of that. We spoke about how people are drinking this, turmeric water and thinning their blood. People trying all kinds of things, all kinds of theories being forwarded easily, saying, "Oh, this takes 4 hours to die," or versus 6 hours, and so on. Most of those things are not going to make a material difference to your life. When in reality, we 9 months that the way you actually spread, that science has been changing constantly, right? It started out with surface spread. And pretty soon now it turns out that the consensus now is that it spreads through the air, right? Yeah. So if you're in a gathering in a closed room, you're most risky, right? Yeah. So if you're in a wedding gathering, in a sports event, in a bar, that's where you're likely to sort of pick it up now. So.
Yeah. Fomites now not, but we digress. All right. I think we pretty much covered. Actually, there's an interesting question here. Does adding salt at various steps while cooking have anything to do with improving the flavor of the food, which is something that, I learned that in culinary school. A lot of chefs will sort of like say that. And again, it's one of the things that we sort of like, you kind of know why, but you don't really.
Yeah. So it's large. Again, it's not an easy answer because it depends on the kind of dish. It depends on the ingredients in the dish, whether it's a homogeneous kind of a gravy or whether it's a dish with large, big pieces that have to absorb salt over time and so on. It depends on the kind of dish that you're cooking. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you're cooking a gravy, remember that it's also reducing down with time. So it's a question of estimation. So if you add the salt ahead of time, you're going to have to think ahead and say, look, this is going to reduce down, so it's going to get salty over time. So you might have to kind of think of that. But in general, as I said, it will depend on if you're having certain sort of vegetables that are still reasonably solid and so on, you want to salt ahead. So you give it a little bit more time for the salt to get into it, right? But gravies, etc., for most part, there's a reasonably wide range of time that you can add it, as long as you're comfortable in being able to estimate salt. In like a sambar or rasam, salt is often the last thing I will add. It doesn't make a difference, right? And also remember, from a pure science standpoint, salt moves through material really, really fast. It's not that it takes. It's not going in slow motion. Many of these things happen really, really fast, right? And salt, both sodium and chloride ions are tremendously efficient at doing what they do, and they're really, really small, right? And they really can't get through most sort of, unless it's absolutely opaque and so on. So, as I said, if it's a dry dish, you might want to kind of salt earlier, and if it's a gravy dish, you have a slightly wider range. Roshni, you might have some sort of wisdom from your culinary school as well. But I've often found that sometimes chefs also tend to take they just learned it the way and they think it works. Not often sort of, sometimes you do it a different way from the chef and it still works, by the way. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the only thing that, one of the things that sort of like various instructors would tell us is if you salt onions before you brown them, then they will brown more later, but more evenly. And that kind of makes scientific sense.
Yes. Oh, that's important, right? See, because salt also dehydrates
release water
ingredients.
Yeah.
It dehydrates plant material. On the other hand, salt actually makes meat and other things more juicy, which seems counterintuitive, but it makes sense. You go run a marathon, you're really tired, you drink water, sugar, and salt. Why do you eat the salt? Because you don't want to lose the water to perspiration. So salt actually prevents muscle tissue from losing water, right? It retains water in the muscle tissue. That's why we actually eat. That's why salt is absolutely essential. And that applies to the meat that you're cooking, right? So as macabre as it might seem, muscle tissue is essentially what you're eating. And if there is salt inside it, it's going to lose less water. It will stay more succulent. So that's why we brine and so on. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to hear the late Roman Empire orgy version of what salt molecules do in water, go read Krish Ashok's book, Masala Lab. It's going to release on the 14th, on the 15th?
Yes, on the 14th, yes.
And it'll also
will be available, yes, on 14th.
Yes.
And it'll also be available in most of the major markets in terms of Europe, UK, US on Amazon appropriately. So.
Yeah, so I mean, this is great. Get a copy, buy copies for everybody in your life who loves cooking, food, and science. Is there anybody who doesn't fit into either of those categories? Yeah, this is great. I think in our chat we have the link to how you can pre-order the book on Amazon.in, and yeah, I mean it's a fantastic buy. It's a great gift. The timing is perfect. It's almost Christmas. Thank you so much, Krish Ashok.
Thank you.
Ashok.
It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Sunaparanta.
Love chatting with you.
Thank you both for making the time to be with us, and we're all looking forward to reading this book very much. And congratulations on your book again.